it's a very nice thing to meet, at least via the virtual medium, David Solway. He is more than a simple columnist. In fact, all columnists, by the way, as such, are simple. He's actually an essayist, which is a step up that particular ladder. He's also a poet, which is probably the highest pole that anybody who deals with words can have to deal with. One of the things, David, just to leap right in, as I tried to prepare, and notice the word tried, go back over your stuff and seeing the bibliographies and seeing the various, how in the name of God have you kept this up for so long?
Well, I don't consider it a chore. I don't consider it a trial or an ordeal. And in fact, Rex, I think very much like you, I don't consider it work. I think of Robert Frost's phrase from one of his poems that when he says that my vocation is my avocation. And I think back, you know, I've spent many years in Greece and going to the beach every day and lying in the sun, but I've never somehow been able just to garner a suntan, just to lie back and relax. I don't know what the word relax means. I've never been on a beach in Greece, where I've done a lot of my writing, without either a volume of Shakespeare, Penguin Shakespeare before me, or a notepad or something like that, because otherwise lying there in the sun, just lying there, is boring.
That's really interesting. How long, not how long, as I think I know how long. What was the first indication to you that words and language were the sun in your sky? That this is where you were. When did it flower, and what does it mean to you? Language and poetry and high prose.
I had a dream some years ago in which life ended. I was somewhere else, and a voice, because I hear voices in my dreams. I don't know why, but I do, and often I write them down, and they turn out to be poems or parts of articles or something like that. But this voice said to me, "Now that you've been translated into some other realm, what do you miss most?" And the answer came immediately from me in my dream: the English language. It was my greatest love. How did that start? How does it start for anybody? My mother told me that I was a very late developer, that I didn't say anything for a couple of years, that I was completely mute. And then at the age of 3 or maybe 4, something like that, I was lying in bed, never said a word, and my mother and my aunt were kibitzing out in the living room, and there was a lot of laughter going on. It was late at night, and apparently the first words I ever spoke, according to my mother, was, "Shut up, no talking, baby wanna seep." And they just broke out in laughter.
No,
those were my first words, you know, and I was telling other people to shut up, not only because I wanted to sleep, but also because when I do the talking, generally speaking, except with people whom I really respect and admire, like you and a few others, I like to do the talking. It's that simple.
Good for you.
You know, the words come out, they're there. And the problem I often have is that I can't keep up with what's in my head.
Yeah.
My word starts tumbling and stumbling because whatever I'm thinking is too far ahead and I'm trying to catch up. So I feel like Charlie Chaplin often, you know, when he plays the waiter running, he's a waiter with a tray of glasses, and the glasses are about to fall off. So he's got to keep running as fast as he can to keep the glasses up, to keep everything intact. I feel that's the way it is with language. I love language, but I have trouble following whatever is going on prior and then subsequent to language, which is thinking. And so this is another great issue. How do you solve that? What is thought? I've often asked myself that. What is thinking? What does it mean? It's not just electronic circuits in the brain. Yeah. It can't just be that. And what is feeling? So I've been reading English philosophers, you know, the modern English philosophers, the pragmatists, well, they're not really pragmatists or language philosophers, but they do have a lot to say about feeling. They write books about the nature of feeling and the difference between feeling and sensation. The fact is, I don't know what a feeling is.
Well,
Feelings. Do you know?
well,
What's a
I
feeling?
don't know. I don't know, but I'll make a suggestion. I'm following you along, at least I hope I am. That perhaps the only instruments are not pragmatic philosophies or even linguistics or any of those types of things. The only real probe is language itself, and in particular, that's at the core of poetry, that it reaches something that defies analysis. Is that possibly a thought?
Who are you asking?
You. I'm asking you.
I don't have answers mainly. Everything is a mystery. Everything is a mystery. I'm not just saying this to be
Yeah.
coy or fey. I'm usually in a state of bafflement. For example, can I give you an example?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, this has nothing to do with words. This has to do with gravity. I've been troubled by the nature of gravity for a long time now. We all know Newton's apple. We know that gravity is supposed to be an attractive force. You feel that when you're walking up a hill, it's tugging at your ankles. You feel that when you're walking down the hill, it's pulling you too fast. It's a force. Then along comes Einstein and tells us that gravity is not an attractive force. It has to do with the curvature of space-time, right? And that's why the Earth goes around the sun, because space is bent around a massive stellar object. And if you have that initial push, which comes from the Big Bang, then things are going to simply circle and go into orbit and whatever it happens to be in that way because of the curvature of space. I've recently read a book called Gravitational Waves. They've discovered, though they believe for the last 50 years, that gravity was also a wave, like electromagnetism, but they have never been able to prove it. But in 2015, and then again in 2019, they set up these tests with monitoring tests with institutions 400 to 4,000 miles apart from one another, trying to detect the gravitational wave from the implosion of a black hole 300 trillion billion quadrillion light years away. And they finally did it. They finally did it. So now gravity is an attractive force. Is it not that, but is gravity the curvature of space? Or is gravity actually a wave with a huge amplitude, not one of those tiny little amplitudes, you know, where the crests go by 100,000 times in 1 second, but the amplitude is so large that it takes 100 million light years for one crest and then one trough and so on. So it's a wave. Now, the thing is, gravity can't be all three because it's mutually contradictory. So I'm coming up with a theory that gravity is more than one thing. That gravity has never been understood because it is somehow diffracted into various forms. It may be one thing diffracted like through a prism, or it may be three different forces that coalesce that we call gravity. That's a mystery to me. I'm writing about that now. You know, I don't understand.
Well, you're a far braver man than I to tread in those waters. It really is. I'm going to bring you back a little bit. I want to know, before we get into some of the politics and stuff that's going on, in the early part of your career, I'm very interested in poetry. Just to make it clear, were there any major, either local or universal? Were there any major figures that, more than any other, either in prose or poetry, that really stamped their example on you? You can go from Shakespeare to you know, Robert Frost, or anywhere in between. What ignited that particular passion?
When I think back, either I don't remember, or it, like many things, it's a spontaneous eruption. I wrote my first poem, I don't know why, when I was 12 years old. Don't ask me why I wrote it. I just wrote it. And it was my first published poem. It was called Water, how important water was, and so on. And it was actually published in the County Terrebonne newspaper in northern Quebec. I don't know why I wrote it. It just did. And then, the next steps were anecdotal, essentially. I met a friend of mine who used to come up to St. Agathe, where I was born and lived until I went to McGill. His name was Henry Moscovich. He was a student of Irving Layton. And Henry was literally the most brilliant person I ever met. I mean, by the age of 16, Henry had read more than I've read now. you know, and his conversation was full of D.H. Lawrence and William Blake and Shakespeare. And he had also, because he was Irving's student, emulated Irving's accent.
Mhm.
And he would chew onions, the way Irving would chew onions, you know, and things like that.
Oh.
And we used to go out in his little, they were quite wealthy. So they had two boats, and this was Lac de Sable in Senegath, which you might know, Sandy Lake. We used to go out in his little boat, and he'd read me from his manuscripts. They all sounded like Irving Layton poems, as I discovered later. But he was brilliant. And we'd sit there in the hot sun in the middle of the lake, and he would take out this black binder.
Yeah.
And I love paper and binders, and he'd open it up and he'd read me his poems. And I thought then, I think I want to be a poet too, even though I was then 14 or 15, I published my first poem and so on. But it was just this business of black binders and paper and poems and Blake and Lawrence. And, you know, I was just a kid. I mean, you know, I went to a country school in Senegath, didn't learn that much there. And here was Henry coming up from Montreal, an Irving student, knew everything. I was just so impressed.
Yeah.
And so that's how it started for me. And I still remember I wrote a poem because my girlfriend left me and went to Henry at that point. It was with Henry, and I was really upset. So I wrote a poem about it, a really bitter poem. And then Henry said, well, let me listen to it. So we went up to the school in the early evening, and we just sat there. You know, it was summer. There was no school, of course, but we used to play tennis in the courts around the school. And I read the poem to Henry, and I remember him, and of course, it was a diatribe against Julie for having left me and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then Henry, he looked at me and he said, that was the wrong word. You should have said, not monster. You should have said mooncalf. So I don't know what mooncalf was. So I had to go home and look it up and all that kind of thing, you know. That's how it all started. And then I met Irving, and I realized that Irving was magnificent and dangerous. And then I went to McGill and I met Louis Dudek. I was a student for some time. And it was Louis who published my first book when I was 18 or 19 years old in the McGill Poetry Series, which was an honor for me because it came after Darrell Hine and Leonard Cohen, except they wrote great books and my book was infinitely lousy. I took it years later. I took it out wherever I could find it. Apparently it's a collector's item now. It's worth something. But I destroyed every copy I could find.
Your own best critic.
So that's how it started. And then later on, of course, through McGill, through university, other universities and so on, and my own researching, I fell in love with certain poets.
Yeah.
William Butler Yates became my
Same
master.
here.
You know, I thought he was the greatest poet of the 20th century.
I think
that, you know. And then, of course, American poets, I began to find American and English poets, and I made good friends with Richard Wilbur, who I think is the finest American poet of his generation. And we got to be friends, through epistolary friends. And I knew we were friends when he wrote me, he said, call me Dick. So, and then he blurbed one of my books, Chess Pieces. So, you know, and he was my second master after William Butler Yeats. Well, there was Irving. It was Irving's vitality and exhibitionism and his magnificent, magniloquent command of language. I still remember conversations we used to have, and I would just listen. As a kid, I was young. I was thinking, geez, how does anybody know so many words? You know, and he would just fulminate. He never stopped. He was fantastic. But I understood he was dangerous in the sense that eventually that every student of his fell into his orbit. And we're ultimately talking about gravity. We're ultimately sucked into the black hole, which is Irving Layton. They all talked like him. They all wrote like him. They all wanted to be him, but they didn't have his talent.
Yeah.
Or his genius, actually, because Irving has written 20 to 25 poems. And as Randall Jarrell once said, if you can be struck by lightning 6 times, you're a genius. Well, Irving was struck by lightning 20 to 25 times, like Robert Frost. So, you know, there was Irving, then there was William Butler Yeats, and of course, Gerard Manley Hopkins. We've talked about him, the two of us in email exchanges, who also became one of my great inspirations. Because he wrote poems in Latin. All his poems were written in Latin. He only published 6 during his lifetime. And I started writing poems in Greek, so I felt there was that there was somehow a relation between us. And of course, Dick Wilbur, just just an extraordinary poet. Just, I don't know how familiar you are with his work, but I
Not much
read
with
his
him,
poem.
though.
I read his poem when I was living in Greece. I used to, on the island of Lesbos, I used to walk up and down the beach every day for months, simply reading and rereading his selected and then his collected. And then there came James Merrill with The Changing Light at Sandover, you know. So these are like sources,
Yeah.
you know. And,
I wonder.
but anyway, they're just magnificent poets, and their command of language and also their intelligence. Because that's another thing, Rex, and then I'll let you go, is that most of the poets I know, there are exceptions, thank the Lord, are not intelligent people. They are politically myopic. They are self-serving. They have a very narrow range of thought. Even some of the poets we know best in this country or are most celebrated. There are exceptions like Eric Ormsby or Michael Harris, and a couple of others like I can talk about. But generally, most poets, I avoid them like the plague. They are pressing people, you know, except the great.
You're hitting a point. I'm on a slightly different angle, but it's the same thing finally. As I passed through the years, I remember being a young person, and that's a good memory, that the idea of a writer, I almost have it capitalized in my head, you would call yourself a writer. That was a very special designation. I knew, by the way, one or two what I'll call writers, and I'm not in that camp. And what I saw in the next 3 or 4 decades is that the word writer and the word artist, which once were not honorifics, they were marks of the highest intelligence, integrity, or communicative ability, now gets plastered onto any forehead that writes a letter to the editor. We've emptied the vessel of the wonderful stuff it contains. Performance art, found poetry. I could go on and on and on. The word doesn't mean what it should mean. If you're a writer, then I'm not a writer. I remember I did know Mordecai Richler a little bit. I remember when he was around. If you could call him a writer, then there's a whole lot of other people you can't. I'm not being in any sense smug about this, but we've emptied those things to the point that they're pedestrian.
Two things, Rex. First of all, you're a very modest man. You are, and you have a way of. You remind me of Janice, my wife. You have a way of disparaging your own achievements. I've written about you in several articles for different magazines and sites and so on. I mean, I remember listening to you before I even knew you in, you know, cross-country checkup. I think you're, first of all, the best columnist in this country. And I think to be a good columnist is to be a good writer. To be a great columnist is to be a great writer. And we can go back in history. And we know of many columnists who are also brilliant writers, especially in the United States. The distinction is really not a valid one. Okay. There are different forms of writing. I mean, poetry, essays, novels, plays, columns. There are collected columns. You know, I consider you a writer. You know, I follow you. I print out your works, your columns, and so on. I never thought I would be doing that years before. When I thought I'll never get to know this guy. You know, I'll just listen to him. You know, so here we are talking, and now I know this guy. You know, and I admire you. So I think you don't have to make that distinction.
Okay.
But your other distinction is valid.
That's what I want to get to, yes.
Yeah. That their language has definitely been denatured over the last, I can't really put a time stamp on it. But anyway, since the 60s, there's been a gradual decline, a gradual declension in the validity and the viability and the third V, vitality of words, culminating now in what we call political correctness, which is introducing the lie into language. And when you do that, the language is very good at lying. When language becomes a lie, then language is no longer expressive. Right? Language is something you lie in. Of course, it's also something you tell the truth in. It's something in which you embody your imaginative visions in. Language and lying can be quite compatible, but when the lie is not simply that the language articulates, but becomes the language, so that you can't do anything else with it but lie for some people, then language is so denatured that you cannot achieve anything of value, anything that will last, anything that will bind the generations together. In other words, it's language without, let's call it, glutarium. There's no glue from one generation to the next any longer. There's no glue between the words you speak and your own mind and your own integrity. There's a divorce in the self as a result. I've watched this happen, and it's the most depressing thing, among other depressing things, to see how one of the greatest gifts we have been given as human beings, the greatest gift is life, because I can't think what we would do without it. So life is a miracle. Language, which enables us to be who and what we are and to communicate with the past and the future. Language is the second great gift. Comes life, comes language, and the third great gift is love. So these are the three L's: life, language, and love. If you don't have life, forget it. But if you have life, you need love and language. Otherwise, you don't have much of a life.
It is very interesting. Everybody cites oral in the English language, and I don't particularly want to right now. There's lots of good stuff in it, but it's by no means sufficiently comprehensive to where we've come at the present time. I'll just take a tangential illustration. All the new words that have been born just recently to masquerade or to veil the imperatives of political correctness. Let's say cis-heteronormative, or there's a million of them out there, gender non-binary, and all these things. It's not just that language has been emptied out, is that we're constructing these masquerade words, and they acquire great power. You can think of 20 examples where some company or some singer or some fool elsewhere says the wrong word and hasn't used a neologism, and he or she gets smacked down. Why are we are supposedly, and I'm going to underline that word, an educated and a well-off society? Why are we allowing this cheapness and this falsity, the status of virtue? Because in many people's minds, it is a virtue not to say the thing that they really wish to say.
Well, you're asking major questions that I think no philosopher on earth has been able to answer, at least.
That's why I called you.
Well, then if you really want an answer, I'll give it to you.
Yeah, sure.
I've got the word, I wish. I don't think there's any single factor that explains it. I remember writing an article, I might have sent it to you, in which I tried to present 5 or 6 or 7 different reasons for this decline in intelligence, this decline in integrity. And there are so many different theories too, but one that I've always adhered to, you find it in William Butler Yates, in his, not only in his poetry, but in his book, his prose book called A Vision, which came out first of all in 1917, and then he rewrote it and republished it in 1925. And there, he developed a theory that goes back to Giambattista Vico in the 18th century, to Gibbons, and ultimately to the Greeks. The idea that every civilization has a term date, that civilizations last for a certain time, just as human life lasts for a certain time. Human life passes faster than a civilization does, as human time passes faster than historical time does. But whether it's Connor Cruz O'Brien, who gives us 200 years in his major book, can't remember the title of it now, or whether it's Yates, who says civilizations persist for 2,000 years, major civilizations, until they somehow collapse or become subsumed in the subsequent civilization or something like that. I don't know what the term date is, but anything human cannot last. That's nature.
Yeah,
When a civilization must decline at some point. In physics, it's called entropy. It's a heat death, and everything grows cold. I mean, that's the way the universe operates. And the principle of entropy must enter into human history and human life as well. Though some have argued, I can't remember who it was, that human culture is the way in which we try to resist entropy.
yeah.
But when I look around me, I don't see that happening because
I read, again, getting ready for this, reread several of your pieces. One of the ones that the presentation was quite good. It was funny. Some of the examples are, well, actually, I have one of the examples I got to read. This is why I stopped teaching. And one of the student papers you quoted here, I just got one sentence out of it. He identified Alexander Pope as the head honcho of the Catholic Church, yes, and who averred on the paper on George Orwell's Animal Farm that George Orwell, author of Animal Farm, was heavily into nature. How does a wealthy society with more universities per square inch than the rest of the world combined, what have these universities become? At least I'm speaking only of the humanities, because I'm sure the sciences cannot go that way. Otherwise, we wouldn't be getting in elevators. What goes on in there? Why did you quit teaching?
A number of reasons, but that was one of them. I mean, what you just cited, that phrase. I mean, that's only one of about,
I know,
3,000 or 4,000. I have notebooks filled with them. It was just getting to be too depressing. Though one of my students gave me the title from one of my education books, actually, because I used to assign them papers about the nature of administration in the college where I was teaching at that time. And I couldn't understand what the student had said in his paper. Ultimately, he wanted to say, what was the title of the book now? The something hypodermic of siccan pods. So I asked him, what do you mean by, I can't remember what the adjective was now. And it's just the title of my book, mind you, but the something hypodermic of siccan pods. And he wanted to say the epidemic of sick, I don't know, administrators or something like that. But it came out as something, hypodermic of siccan pods. And I thought, well, that's a great title for a book. So I had to write the book in order to conform to the title. But, sometimes it was funny and sometimes it was interesting, but generally it was very, very depressing. That was one reason I decided to get out. Another reason is that they were trying to fire me. Because I would travel for about 2 weeks every semester under the auspices of the Department of External Affairs for our country. To represent Canada at Canada Day ceremonies and embassies and universities and so on in Europe.
Yeah.
So during those 2 weeks, I would have my classes. I'd always prepared the classes, and I would have a colleague or a teacher or a poet come in and take over those 2 weeks of classes, or there'd be 3 or 4 teachers. They had the syllabus before them. They knew what to do. There was no problem. And when I'd come back, I'd discuss with my students, the good students, basically, what I discovered in Europe and what had happened, and they were interested, many of them. No, but some of my colleagues, I don't know why, but other friends of mine said it was jealousy because I published more books than the entire department put together by a factor of about 10. So they tried to get me fired and one of my colleagues, I won't give you his name, but he was a well-known person, took over my satire class and then began questioning my students, interrogating them about me. And he found 6 who I had failed and who didn't like me. So they said I wasn't teaching them anything and I just went away, which was not true. So about a third of the department decided that they would have to get rid of me. So they went to the administration and they raised a petition to fire me. And I didn't even know about it. I didn't even know about it until somebody told me. I said, what's going on here? You know, and then, because I did have good students also,
Yeah.
you know, and one of these good students approached me and he said, the rest of the class knows about what is happening and we have taken up a petition on your behalf because we love you.
Good.
So that petition went up, and as a result, the other petition, which was in the student office, disappeared.
Ah,
So I retained my position, but I realized that I didn't want to teach in an institution where 1/3 of the department wanted to get rid of me, essentially because I had outpublished them. And the administration couldn't tolerate me because I wasn't politically correct.
this is, there was a time, at least I think there was, when you could almost worship universities. And I don't want, it's not a matter of age, and it's not a matter of nostalgia or hearkening for some golden moment in the past. It is now undeniable. You see it in terms of what you just talked about, and more recently, the phenomenon of so-called cancel culture. I have never understood in the last 10 or 15 years, Jordan Peterson would be an excellent example, why when there is an independent mind of considerable integrity or capacity, and that mind makes itself known to the uninformed hostility of very young people, that the university, which is the guardian of mind, as far as I understood it, and has in its way, in its body, has people that are protected by the almost singular doctrine of tenure, everyone else could get fired, that the university, as the guardian of the mind, doesn't stand up for what is centrally true and for what is not conspiratorial, and in the case of political correctness, for what it knows in its own heart is false. Where's the courage of intellect these days?
Well, you can find it in one or two people at the National Post. Not everybody, but one or two, like you and Conrad. You find maybe one person in every department, like my wife Janice, who stood up in her department, both at the University of Saskatchewan and at the University of Ottawa. And they were trying to fire her too at the University of Ottawa, just because she was honest and straight and clear and moral, highly moral. And these are signs. These are danger signs for most of the people around us. Now, where did that start? This is really the question.
Yeah,
I think our universities, mutatis mutandis, are very much like the universities in the 30s in Germany. I think not that we're Nazis as such, but in a way we are, or we're communists, or who knows what we are, but we are totalitarians. That is what is happening. Our university, the German university was the model for the American university. It was the model for Harvard, the model for Yale, for Princeton, for Johns Hopkins. And what happened to the German university? It was infected by politics. It was infected by anti-Semitism. It was infected by the decline of the culture at that time, the pollution, the poisoning of that culture. It entered the university. You had Heidegger at Freiburg, who was giving the Nazi salute and getting rid of his Jewish compatriots, some truly great thinkers. So how did that happen? It's the same question as how could a country that gave us Beethoven and Bach and Mozart and so on give us Hitler and Goebbels? And how is it possible? It was possible. It's possible because we harbor it all within us. It's not that I'm so pure and you're so pure. We have that in us. We know we have it in us and we do our best to fight it. But other people don't fight it. I don't know why, but it just doesn't happen. Here it started in the 60s. The actual decay of our educational establishment started with John Dewey in the late 1919, 1920, and so on, with what he called progressive education. We now have the word progressivist, which was really child-centered and led ultimately to the self-esteem movement and to the universities of the 1960s. I was at Berkeley. I knew Mario Savio when they took over the university at that time, the free speech movement. I was all for it. It was a great big party. I was a kid. It seemed like great. Parties were great. The girls were pretty. It was that kind of thing. was only later on I thought back and I thought, Jesus, that wasn't free speech that they were advocating. They
No.
were throwing Clark. They throw the chancellor out of practically out of off the balcony. It was violent in its essence, but I didn't understand that and young kids don't understand that kind of thing either. But if you think about it, you eventually do come to understand it. So it started there, and then the Black Panthers moved in, and David Horowitz talks about that because he was at Berkeley and he used to man the Black Panther tables, and he was a communist until the Black Panthers killed a woman that he knew, and that changed his mind about everything. And then they had the red diaper babies because communism, I don't understand it, but it was already, it's been here, it was here before the 60s. I mean, we had, as we know, that's what McCarthy was all about. And by the way, I think McCarthy has got a bum rap. Everybody says McCarthyite, they're acting like McCarthy. The left now is McCarthyite. McCarthy was onto something. This is, it's very clear. If you read any of the books coming out at that time, what's his name? You know who I mean. The spy who wrote that fantastic book around the same time. Whitaker Chambers.
Okay, Chris.
Yeah. And McCarthy was a drunk. He was intemperate, but he was largely right. And people now justify his enemy, Lillian Hellman, who is the greatest liar that ever put pen to paper. And McCarthy, who was trying to find the truth and to do something about it, is now aligned in the press, and his name has become a byword for treason of some kind. The university has gone in that direction. It is the left. The left has come in, and the left can never improve anything. It can only, when it becomes institutional, it can only destroy what's in front of it.
It's an abrupt thing, but I'm going to wrap it around to go back to the beginning. One of the things we started, because, as I said, you're a writer and you're a poet, started with language again. And you're seeing now that the McCarthy metaphor as being exhausted, I'd agree with. But you're seeing now that even a single word, a comment made 15 years ago or something, the forces of censorship we have in Ontario very recently, a couple of weeks ago, that they're drawing up a whole list of books, that everything from A Little House on the Prairies on, that they're going to take out of the library. We're not in Weimar, we're not in Nazi Germany, but I wonder if in its impact on mind and its impact on genuine culture, our own prosperity has made us very careless of civil liberties. We've forgotten the inheritances that the really good minds have given us, and we're allowing a kind of plastic totalitarianism to rule the lives of many. As a person, again, really keen on the center sense of language, how much more can we have this falsity, because it is a falsity, and how much more can we tolerate the intolerant that are blasting people in the name of tolerance?
Yes, which is Herbert Marcuse's
repressive
thesis, Repressive Tolerance. Exactly, and which is an oxymoron, which is, I don't know, which is a moron who's been educated at Oxford, essentially, when I think about it verbally in that way. We got repressive tolerance. You can't have a thing called repressive tolerance. If it's tolerance, it's not repressive. If it's repressive, it's not tolerant. So you put it together into an oxymoron, and everybody said yes, all the students at that time. That's part of it. That's partly where the damage started.
Yeah.
It was with the notion of repressive tolerance, and it was with the Frankfurt School that came over and should have known better, with people like Herbert Marcuse and Erich Fromm. Though Fromm has written some very good things, but still he was a great disciple of Marx and said Marx was the most interesting man of his time and that kind of thing. And, the whole school effectively poisoned the parietal atmosphere of the university. It began there. And then you got the psychedelics coming in, and then you got the Black Panthers coming in, and then you got Alan Bloom writing, the closing of the American Mind, in 1984, I believe. He saw it all happening, and he was warning us even then. He was
Yeah.
at Cornell, and he could see it happening out his window, looking his office window, and he was warning us. Now, how did all this happen? I don't know. I just go back sometimes to the theory. A civilization will find a way to destroy itself. Inevitably it must, because it does have a kind of cosmically imposed term date. It's what who was it? Toynbee said that, that civilizations don't die of murder, they die of suicide. I think all that we're seeing now, from the 60s on to the present moment, with the complete denaturing and almost the destruction of language, is merely our feminism, radical feminism, all the various movements of the time now, the way electoral fraud, which is something that's become endemic, everything is just a symptom of this great disease. And the great disease is the fact that civilizations will find a way to terminate themselves. They always must, just as we do. We have our vices. If we didn't have any vices whatsoever, if we didn't eat junk food, if we didn't smoke, if we didn't drink our scotch, if we didn't drink too much wine, if we didn't, give ourselves over to pure sexuality and that kind of thing, would we live to 200? Maybe, but maybe we wouldn't find it worth it. I don't know. But we find our own ways. That's what Freud was saying. Every person finds his own way to shuffle off this mortal coil. And every civilization will find its own way.
Okay.
And this, what I think is happening now, is unstoppable. That's the thing. We're all talking about, is there some way to reverse course? Is a course correction possible? And I say no.
Yeah.
I don't think it's possible. It's over. Everything that we see now is only a symptom of a universal decay. It cannot be stopped. So I remember that, I remember an interview that André Prat, you must remember him. He used to be the editor of La Presse.
Yes.
And he was in Montreal, and then he went off to Quebec City. And they came out to the college where I was teaching at that time to do an interview. And there was a 2-page spread in La Presse, and they had students there, pictures of students and all kinds of things. I don't know why that happened. I think it was because I was Quebec's token Anglophone. So, I won a lot of awards, including the Grand Prix du Livre de Montréal and all that other stuff. A lot of stuff translated and all that kind of thing. So somehow I was a big shot in Quebec. I'm nothing in the rest of Canada. And so he came out to do the interview. And at the end, we adjourned to my office, which was a reconstituted broom closet. And he asked me, he said, if you believe that the Titanic is going down, which was my thesis, why do you continue teaching? Why do you continue writing? Why do you continue opposing that if it's inevitable? And my reply was, it's the same thing. Like, you have an illness. Let's say you have diabetes. Now that's going to take care of you pretty quick, unless you take the right medications. And if you take these medications on a regular basis and do it properly and so on, you will survive as long as anybody else. So why are you taking these medications? He says, well, to survive. I said, well, that's what we do as writers. We know that the ship is going down, but we continue to bail, to defer what the French call the naufrage, to defer the catastrophe. It's finished. It's over. But we don't. It's better to go down tomorrow than today. It's better to go down 10 years from now than next year. It's better to take insulin or whatever you need to take so that you can last longer. That's what we are doing. I am convinced. Well, if we're honest with one another as writers, as thinkers, as philosophers, whatever.
Well, I think, again, David, I'll have to stop it there, but I will think that, to speak purely of literature rather than all literature, music in particular, I do not know if they will right the ship at all. But if it is going down, I would want a book on one side and a symphony on the other. Listen, you've been extremely generous with your time. I had no claim upon it, so I appreciate you giving me so much of it. And perhaps we will do this again fairly soon. Thank you very much, and say hello to your wife.
I will, and perhaps you'll be talking to her too.
I hope so.
Point.
I really hope so.
And also thank you for your time.
Okay. We're on the same wavelength. I love Yates was my first one too.